Okay, the meeting is now streaming live on YouTube. Okay, I guess I will start. Let me just pin your video. Yeah. Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Oh wait, don't start yet. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, so you were saying about the relationship, because like a lot of people must be wanting to use the name. So
They are allowed, like, okay, now we have the thumbs up. Start? Okay, start. Hello everyone, welcome today to our webinar. We have today is Independence Day, but it's also a great day to learn something new. And today we're going to talk about a great topic, which is a rainbow new deal for post-COVID recovery. And this is a great way to kick off our People for Planet campaign, which is basically understanding how environmental issues affect the marginalized communities and how they're the most affected by it. And as environmentalists, how to navigate this to make sure we help come up with solutions that are respectful and mindful and where they can lead us. Um, let me introduce myself. My name is Shiranjani. I've been with Fridays for Future for almost a year now. I'm a student from Bangalore. Um, and we have with us the incredible Ashish Kothari. He has been in the environmental movement since the 1970s, and a lot of what today's environmental movement has been shaped up like people like him. Um, Ashish is also active with a number of people's movements, and he's also one of the co-founders of Kalpa Vriksh. He helps coordinate the Vikalp Sangam, which is the Alternatives Confluence process in India and the global tapestry of alternatives globally. He also helps run the website and is associated with the Radical Ecological Democracy, and he has authored and edited over 30 books. So, um, yeah, Ashish sir, now the floor is yours. How do I do that? Just a second. Tarun, you need to unmute.
okay, I think it's done. Hi, okay. Thanks a lot, Shiranjani, and hello to everybody. Thanks for this opportunity. It's great always to be able to speak to young people in India, especially in these times when it seems very necessary for young people to take the leadership in changing the course or the direction in which India and the world is taking. So maybe I should start with a little bit of history of my journey to where I am right now, and the journey of the organization I work with. So I started as a kind of an animal rights activist or environmental activist in high school many generations back. And in those days, there was actually very little talk about environmental issues, but we were growing up in Delhi, and in New Delhi, there was already lots of air pollution, water pollution, and traffic congestion, and so on. And also the destruction of a very large patch of forest which runs through Delhi, which is the last part of the Aravalli mountain range. So we as people who are kids who are interested in nature, environment, bird watching, etc., we decided that we wanted to do something about this and not just go out and enjoy nature, but also try and do something to protect it. So that's how our journey started back in 1978, 79. And those of you who might be in Delhi or have been through Delhi would have seen a very large patch of forest running through the heart of Delhi, Delhi University, all the way to South Delhi, JNU. And that's the ridge forest that we tried campaigning for and tried to help protect. And still, much of it is there. From there, actually moving into much larger issues, we went on two treks into the Chipko movement area, which then was quite active with trying to protect forests in the Himalaya. Then in the early 80s, we did a number of sort of on ground investigations, action research kind of thing in our own naive way on pollution issues, on industrial thermal power pollution in Delhi. And then in 1983, a 50-day walk along the Narmada River to look at the kind of impacts of dams, the big dams that were proposed then, which many of which are already up and have created the kind of devastation that we wanted to study then. So I'm just giving this very briefly to also indicate that as youth, I think one of the lucky things or one of the fortunate things for me, for people like me and a number of my colleagues in Kalpavriksha, was that we were able to go into rural and urban areas to actually look at things on the ground, to learn things from movements like the Chipko movement, 84 onwards, join the Narmada Bachao Andolan. And it was through all that kind of involvement, apart from, of course, voraciously reading material and so on, that we were able to build up some sort of a perspective which broadened from wildlife conservation and animal rights, not leaving them behind, but broadened from that into looking at issues also from economic, political, social, cultural perspective. So trying to put a more comprehensive vision of understanding what was happening to the environment. So even as environment, nature, etc., remained a core, we looked at or began to understand and work on a number of these other issues. And I think some of that understanding over the last 30, 40 years is what I will try and convey in the presentation today. So I think that's enough about my journey. If there's curiosity about that, we can talk about that more later. I'm going to share screen and share a presentation. So let me know, Shiranjani, whether this works or not. Yeah, is that okay? Can you see it full screen? Okay. So there's a reason why I've said rainbow recovery or a rainbow new deal is the way I'm putting it, because as we know across the world, and especially in Europe and America, there's a lot of discussion about a green new deal or a green recovery from COVID. And to my mind, of course, green as in environmental has to be very much at the core of any transformation that we are looking for in society. But that's not enough, because like I said about my own journey, we have to also be able to build in the social, economic, political aspects to it, which means red as in, let's say, equality kind of thing, blue as in, because green is only forests and grasslands, but we also have 70% of the earth is marine and lots of rivers and so on. So you've got blue, and you can think of multiple other ways of it. And of course, rainbow is also used by movements for multiple gender identities and multiple sexualities. So in some way, to me, it seems as if we need a multi-dimensional and a sort of intersectoral transformation and revolution, and not just a green one. And I think this is very important, because you can actually get into, we can have that discussion later, you can get into situations where green becomes a kind of another imposition. Green colonialism, in some senses, that is the word that people have used, where you go to a forest area and you say, oh, the tiger has to be protected, kick all the Adivasis out. Or the global north tells us that, oh, you guys, you have to protect your forest while we can keep polluting the earth. So I think there has to be, in that sense, multiple different dimensions. And from my discussions with Shriranjani and others, I'm very, very happy, and we can again get back into that discussion later. Very happy to know that Fridays for Future India is also going well beyond a Eurocentric approach to look at these fundamental issues of social inequality, economic inequality, the way in which colonialism or other forms of discrimination have impacted us. Oh, oops, my phone is on. Just hold on a sec.
So Ashish sir doesn't own a mobile phone. He only has a landline. And I think that's really cool because very few people I know have that. Don't
Sorry
have a
about that.
mobile phone.
Sorry about that. I forgot to.
No worries.
I can't switch it off. You can't switch off a landline. But anyway, I put it outside. So, so that's why I'm calling it rainbow recovery, and I'll get into this in more detail now. So let's see if this works. All right. So I think the backdrop to this is the fact that India claims to have been very successful in its model of development, especially in since the early 1990s, when we moved into a globalized process of economic development. We've had fairly, until recently, we had fairly high rates of economic growth or GDP growth, which is the main indicator for development. The finance minister, I think a few months back, said we are now before COVID, we're the fifth largest economy in the world. And there are any other indicators, the conventional indicators, per capita income, per capita ownership of private cars, cell phone connections, a billion cell phone connections, etc. We seem to be doing rather well. So this is the sort of the image of India, the glitzy part of it, which is what is being projected globally. But there is another part, and I think when we get to that, in order to get to that, we need to also ask ourselves, what is development? This is a question that we've actually forgotten to ask ourselves. We just assume that every country has to develop, and it has to develop in a particular way. So if you look at the origin of the word, and every once in a while I'm going to try and talk about the origins of words, because I think it's really important to look at, okay, what did democracy originally mean, what did development originally mean, etc. So the original meaning of this, which comes from biology, actually is the opening up of, say, the embryo or the seed into a plant, into a sapling, into a fuller plant, into a tree, etc. No? Similarly, the human embryo into a baby, into a full adult. So in the economic or other context, it was also meant to open up all the opportunities for us to develop ourselves as human beings. Unfortunately, since the 1960s or so, and if you look at the history of it, it's actually a very deliberate imposition of a particular narrowing down of the definition for development to simply mean material and mostly then financial uh, growth, GDP, as I mentioned earlier. And what this has meant is what I'll talk about in a minute. But I think it's very important to understand that this model is actually only about 70 years old. It's not like it's God given or something that is because sometimes when we question development, people look at us and say, oh, it's like you're questioning oxygen, but not really. It's only something that's very recent. And if you then look at the other side of what development has meant, it has actually meant an enormous amount of violence. This advertisement from 30 years back, I think, is very typical of a view that's even prevalent now, even though maybe ad agencies won't put out an ad like this anymore because they'll know it's politically inappropriate. But it's still the same thing, that if we want this form of development, and if nature is in the way, just bulldoze through, uproot forests, cut through wetlands and grasslands, or whatever it is that is a hurdle in the way of development. And this is still very much the mindset of mainstream development. And because of this, we see, as we know, and I think you folks in Fridays for Future will definitely know this already, is that we are already, as a species, we have already crossed several planetary biophysical limits, whether it's to do with carbon, of course, we know that, or biodiversity loss, and we're in the danger of crossing many others. Last 2 years back, a study was shown which said that we are already using 1.5 times what the Earth can replenish in terms of natural resources. That includes carbon, water, etc. And the same study a similar study was done in India, which also showed that, for instance, our development process is already using twice our biological capacity. Now, clearly, this is unsustainable. You cannot actually have this form of growth and sustain it. But the other part of this is, if you look at the specific ecological ramifications, these are just some, those of you who are fond of statistics, these are a few that we picked up over the last few decades. And I won't go into all of these, we don't have the time. But two things stand out here. Number one, that this process of economic growth has actually endangered at least 10% of our wildlife with extinction. Some have already gone extinct, but others are in the process of. And there's probably hundreds of species that we've never even known about or recorded, which are going extinct. Every time a rainforest is destroyed or a grassland is destroyed, something is endangered. But at the same time, also, we see that because of the situation that in India, people are directly dependent on nature and natural resources for their survival, for their economic livelihoods, and so on, that it directly impacts at least 400 million people. I'm talking about direct. Indirectly, we are all affected, but a very direct day to day impact on hundreds of millions of people. Now, it is often argued that yeah, okay, there's some damage and so on, but every country has to go through this process of development, and in that process initially there'll be some ecological destruction, but we will then make enough money to then protect the environment. And we have to do this because we have to move people out of poverty. We have to give employment and so on. So a colleague and I actually did a very detailed study of, especially since 1991, when we had these very high rates of growth, whether in fact there has been substantial new employment created and whether poverty has reduced. And again, we have lots of information on this for those interested, but our conclusion was that in fact there's very little net new additional employment created in the formal sector, which is where all the most of the investment goes. And that if you take poverty as not just $1.50 per day, the stupid World Bank kind of definition, but in terms of whether people have adequate nutritious food, clean drinking water, clean air, adequate housing, and so on, you find, according to us, that at least 70% of India is still facing poverty, and that there are newly impoverished people, especially those who are physically displaced and dispossessed because of so-called development projects. When you have a mining project or a big hydroelectricity project, there are people who are being displaced, and many of them from places where they at least had access to clean water, living next to a river, or they at least had access to medicinal plants and food from the forest, but they don't anymore when they're displaced and put into so-called resettlement sites, or basically just told to go away and fend for themselves. And now we have seen in COVID times that this section of the population, which is 90% of the working population, for instance, is amongst the most vulnerable when the economy shuts down or when the government takes authoritarian measures in the name of protecting people's health. And that is also leads to very severe violations of even just fundamental human rights of just having enough food and so on. And we've got so many horrifying and moving tales of people dying, trying to get back home, walking back home, or simply dying out of starvation and so on. Now, we also, of course, do have had very high levels of growth. So then if it's not benefiting a very large section of people, where is the money going? And this is another phenomenon that I think this is a global phenomenon, but in India, it's very, very stark, where you see that now 5% of India, rich, like many of us on this call, are earning 95% of its income. I think about 5% of India has 60% of its wealth and so on. And this inequality is actually increasing, it's not decreasing. So economic growth based development models actually both cause ecological devastation and also misery, suffering, and increasing inequality. And that's what enables the world's biggest single family house to be in a city in which 40% of the population don't have even a proper hut to stay in. I think most of you would know whose house that is, India's richest man. And so many people like us actually are fine with this, because for us, like, we have access to all the world's goods. We can buy virtually anything we want from anywhere in the world. And be also buffered in some sense from the kind of economic distress that, say, migrant workers are facing or small farmers are facing, etc. But it also means that our consumption levels, and this is an issue we need to always come back to, and I think this is an issue that young people need to really confront, is levels of consumption. We did a simple calculation, found that the rich consume 17 times more than the poor. And this is very important to point out when people say that India's problems are all because of population increase. Yes, population is an issue, but a much bigger issue is patterns of consumption. Who decides where to do what, and who consumes what and how much. And of course, there's a big psychological or emotional issue of whether, in fact, all of this consumerism really brings happiness beyond a point. So finally, just a couple of other points on the depressing part, and then I want to get into the more hopeful part of it, which I want to focus on much more. I think this process of development, and if you look at, in some senses, Western modernity in its full sense, is also something that has created a much higher level of individual alienation from nature, but also from each other. There's this selfishness, individuality, loneliness. I mean, if you look at it, United Kingdom has a minister for loneliness. Just imagine, that's the indicator of development that we should be looking at. And I call that a process from where livelihoods were occupations that were integrated within society, within culture, within ecology, to completely disjointed jobs, which, whether it's in the traditional sector or in the modern sector, are soul deadening. And I call that a process from livelihoods to deadlihoods. How do we reverse that is what I want to get into next. But and yes, I mean, if somebody like Gandhiji had walked down any of the MG roads today, the MG road in Pune and Bangalore and so on, I think he would have been an extremely perplexed man. There's much more detail on this in this book that Aseem Srivastava and I wrote a few years back. So there's 300 pages of depressing analysis if anybody wants to get even more depressed than what normally these days one is. So please take a look at it. But the second part of the book is what I want to focus on, which is looking at what are the alternatives. Just the last point I want to make here before I get into that is that COVID has done a number of things. One, it has very sharply and visibly exposed the fault lines of today's society and economy, and especially the kind of ecological devastation and how that brings up even the sort of pandemics that we have, the zoonotic diseases and so on. But also, it has created a situation for states, for nation states, for governments and private corporations to even further the kind of authoritarian tendencies or profiteering tendencies that they had. And in a country like India, unfortunately, it's also become an opportunity for some kind of hyper nationalism, pushing one religion down everybody's throats. On the other hand, it's also created an opportunity for us to question the fundamentals of the system and to say that there are alternatives, and can we actually see this as an opportunity for very significant course correction, which is where I want to head to now. And when we do that, we also then have to question the kind of answers that the system is giving us. So these days, for instance, the latest flavor in the last couple of months from our government has been self-reliance. COVID has shown us that every community needs to be self-reliant, India needs to be self-reliant, etc. But if you look at the actual policies that are being promoted or the programs that are being promoted under the name of Atmanirbhar Bharat, what we see is they're saying, okay, 40 more coal mining blocks in central India for India to be self-reliant, or opening up and reducing. You've seen that with your campaign on the environmental impact assessment, ease of doing business, so that 100 more companies from wherever in the world can come and make in India. And what people are saying is that, look, we already do make in India. The handicrafts industry or the handlooms industry, which is severely disabled by successive governments and current policies, is saying we've already been making these things. Why do you need to invite hundreds of companies from outside, or why do you even need to invite Indian corporations like Reliance, etc., to make things that we are making on a sustainable way with our own thing, and therefore also creating our own employment? So these are questions that I think which are very, very important for us to ask. So that leads me to this question of, are there alternatives, or are we kind of doomed to follow the same path that Western nations have followed? And I think there's two kinds of alternatives we need to look at. One is movements of resistance, like you young people raised in a very effective way the whole issue of environmental impact as the whittling down of environmental laws with the recent EIA notification. There's been movements of different kinds, grassroots movements against state imposed destructive development projects, against more fundamental structures of oppression like capitalism and patriarchy or state domination, against casteism and so on. And to me, this is a very, very important part of the alternative because, um, to give you the example of this particular picture, this is from a anti-dam movement in central India on the Indravati River 30 years back. And in the narration that they were giving was not just the fact that we will be displaced and our villages will be destroyed and so on, but they were saying that when you look at the river, you think of it as megawatts, as power, electricity. When for us, the river is our mother. So we will not allow our mother to be shackled with a big dam. And in fact, that was one of the successful movements against two big, very big dams that were being proposed at that time. So it's also showing us the fact that there are alternative narratives, alternative worldviews, alternative visions of what a society could be or what well-being could be compared to the dominant system that we have right now. But resistance is not enough. And this is something that's very, very important for movements like Fridays for Future, because we also need to then build our own visions and practices of what we think needs to be done to meet human needs and aspirations, especially in a country like India where there is such significant levels of deprivation and poverty, actual poverty and so on. So in the last few years, we've been working with and documenting and networking hundreds of such alternatives on the ground in India and more recently globally. And I'm going to give you a bit of a glimpse of a little taste of the kinds of alternatives I'm talking about, which help us to uh, get towards a much more different way of looking at well-being. This is one of the most inspiring for me. This is a group of about 4.5, 5,000 Dalit women farmers and some Adivasi women farmers who 30 years back faced the same sorts of oppression that Dalits and women and small farmers face. So, like gender inequalities, casteism, and class inequalities, and hunger and deprivation, and so on. Then they mobilized themselves along with the help of a couple of NGO activists to form women sanghas in each of about 75 villages. They collectivized a lot of their operations. They brought back into their agriculture their traditional seeds. They converted completely to organic farming. They fought for land rights for women, which is very unusual in India. They made grain banks in each of these villages. They created their own alternative public distribution system, and essentially basically created a sort of a local circular economy, along with fighting for social justice and so on, that has enabled them to today claim that they have not just enough food, but food sovereignty, which means complete control over their everything to do with food, the seeds, the water, the land, the knowledge, and so on. And I think this distinction between food security and food sovereignty is very, very important. Maybe we can discuss it in the discussion if you want. And so the movement has been so revolutionary and so successful that, in fact, in the COVID period, these women who themselves faced hunger 25, 30 years back are today contributing to the district's relief funds and feeding 1,000 glasses of millet porridge every day to health workers, police workers, and so on. Um, Another example, also led by women, is from Uttarakhand, where this group called Mati started with the movement against domestic violence against women and children, and then moved into also looking at economic independence for women, both through traditional livelihoods like making products out of wool, but also new livelihoods like home-based ecotourism. Right now, they're struggling a bit because the ecotourism is shut down, but because they also have other sources of livelihood, including agriculture and so on, they're able to cope reasonably well. And here also, both women and youth have taken quite a role. So there's also something called the Jungli School, deliberately called Jungli School because Jungli in India, unfortunately, has become a insult, where in fact it should be a compliment, which is what they say. So that is an alternative school where kids learn all kinds of things which they don't normally learn in their normal school. Now, there are dozens of such examples. I can go on and on. But basically, one of the things that's very interesting in these is that where villages have been revitalized, where social justice and economic justice issues have been tackled, and local economies have been revived, or new opportunities have been created, out migration has actually either stopped, or in fact there's reverse migration. This is a huge issue because we know that across the world we feel that rural urban migration is inevitable, but in fact these communities have shown that it's not. You can in fact even reverse that migration, if you're able to create vibrant rural economies and societies. There are many examples. One of the most interesting ones, especially again in COVID times, is Kudumbashri, which is 50 lakh women in Kerala, supported by the state, that have their own local livelihood options in their own villages. And Kudumbashi units in each of the villages were extremely crucial in helping every village, every community to tide over the COVID crisis, to build community health systems, to make sure that everybody had enough food, and so on. Um, we can move to an urban situation, and again, we can find examples of where people are trying to take control over their lives in some form at least, and make the government also accountable. So this is in Bhuj, where this program called Homes in the City has tried to create more localized governance, more participation by people in, especially in the poorer colonies, including the empowerment of women and young girls, and try and do their own housing, water security, and so on and so forth, and planning of their own colonies. And the basic thing is to say, okay, we need to have the information and the power to be able to control our destinies, even in a city, not just in a village, but, and so therefore also to affect how the city planning itself should happen. So that's a very interesting movement from an urban context. I think it's important to also state that people like us can also make a huge difference. People like us, I mean, sort of the middle classes and upper classes, people who are privileged enough to be on a webinar, for instance. And again, a couple of examples. This is from Bengaluru, where the lake that you can see on the bottom left-hand side is Kaikondrahalli, which had been completely destroyed and dumped on, and the land mafia was eyeing it for doing construction. But all the surrounding colonies got together and protected it, revived it, regenerated it, and now it's a thriving ecosystem in which wildlife has come back, and people are able to enjoy it um, for various aesthetic and other uses. And similarly, young people are in fact producing or creating zero waste kind of options. Now, I remember when I was young, I could go to a grocery shop and buy things without any plastic or thermocol or whatever it was. I would have to take my own vessel and bring back the dal or the rice or whatever. That's completely gone out of the system now. Everything is packaged in double, triple layers. What these two young people in Goa and many others in other cities have also now have created is a new form of no waste thing, where again you would go with your own vessel or your own bag. At the most, they'll give you a paper bag, but no plastic or anything like that. So there are a number of these sorts of things happening also amongst the elite and the privileged. Now, I want to get from there to talking about political governance, because I think unless one looks at who takes decisions with regard to nature, environment, development, etc., we won't be able to get too far. This is an example which I think, Sri Anjani, you were asking me about what's closest to Zapatista in India. This is not nearly as close, in the sense it's not even fighting for a complete autonomy from the state, but it is definitely it's a movement, Adivasi Swasashan, or tribal self-rule in central India, which has been around for 2 or 3 decades now, saying that indigenous India, Adivasi India, has its own cultural roots, its own ecological wisdom, its own knowledge, its own ways of its own economy, and so on. And what the mainstream model of development is doing and imposing on us, we will not accept. So here's a movement of about 90 villages gathered as a federation or a Mahagram Sabha, fighting against mining, but also asserting how they will protect the forest, how they will sustainably use the forest for their own economy, empower women to also be part of decision-making processes, and revive and build their own cultural identity against the imposition of, let's say, uh, dominant religion. Um, this itself builds on a much earlier example called Mendhalekha, where 30 years back, 35 years back, they were part of the same anti-dam movement that I showed you the picture of. And then after that, they declared that in our village, uh, we elect the government in Mumbai and Delhi, but in our village, we are the government. And I'll come back to this as a notion of democracy in a little while. Similarly, protection of nature and ecosystems and wildlife populations. There's one model, which is the official one, which is where you have tiger reserves and you kick Adivasis out. And then there's another model where communities are stressing that they are the ones who have been traditionally conserving and can also conserve in the future, even if that needs maybe some changes in behavior or consumption patterns. So there's hundreds of examples again of communities reasserting their conservation role for nature and wildlife. Now, I think one very, very crucial transformation that needs to happen is also with regard to education and communication, because we see the way, and all of you young people who are on this call will know this, that the kind of schools that we have, the kind of colleges that we have, they basically orient us to fit into the dominant system. Okay, either you get trained to become a corporate whatever something, or a big time lawyer, or somebody who fits into the IAS system and gets into government, etc. Very little of the orientation to question things, the orientation to build your own creativity, to enhance your own creative potential, etc., and also to relink with nature and with society. Almost no orientation to be a responsible person towards everybody else. It's all about, okay, your own individual thing, come first, become selfish, earn more money, etc., etc. So here we have examples of alternative learning spaces that have actually attempted to do something very different, is to rebuild our connection with nature, to think of ourselves as human beings that are linked to other human beings, as commons and collectives, to question everybody, including our teachers, to sort of learn to be our own minds and not just be passive recipients of things that we get on social media or whatever. The same thing with the media. Today, as we know, the media is controlled either by the government or by private corporations. So the attempt to try and create much more free, much more independent media is also very, very important. And again, a few examples here. Um, by the way, I forgot to mention, but I'll show you a website later in which I think virtually all the examples I'm giving you, we do have more stories or case studies, so much more material that's available if you want to look more into what's happening. I do want to also say that it's not as if what the government does is always wrong and bad. You do have situations where there's a sensitive politician somewhere or a sensitive official somewhere, and when there's a groundswell of both practice and advocacy and pressure, you can get a more accountable decisions, or decisions of policy level decisions, which create more accountability or enable more transformations to take place. These are some laws, for instance, that have come in the last 2-3 decades, which have enabled much more transparency or much more accountability, or enabled communities, for instance, to claim back control over collective forest rights, or programs and schemes that enable more organic farming to spread, and so on. So I think this is very important, that as we fight for fundamental transformation and for autonomy and so on the ground, and Swaraj, which I'll talk about in a minute, we also, the state exists, it's there, so we also have to make it more accountable, create more spaces within the system to make the change. Now, I could spend as much time with alternatives around the world, but we don't have that time. So I'm just going to give you a few examples. Firstly, I love this map because it's another way of decolonizing ourselves. Oops, sorry. Because we're always, whenever I show this map, people say, oh, ye ulta kyun hai? Why is it upside down? And I say, look, the world is round. So depending on where from the space you're looking at it, it's gonna, something can be right side up or wrong side. The map we're used to is a very colonial map. It was made in the time when Europe was colonizing half the globe and was showing itself as being right on top and much bigger than it actually is. So this map also shows the actual sizes of the continents. And you can see that England disappears here. So, but also to be able to show you lots of examples of radical alternatives happening around the world. This book that I've showed you on the top right hand side, I'll come back to that in the end, gives you 100 examples of this kind of the same kind of things that I've spoken about for India. And I'm going to give you just 2 or 3. This is a very, very interesting one. It's in the heart of one of the most war torn, conflict ridden areas of the world. Conflict between or in the area of Syria, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, where the Kurdish movement, especially more recently led by women, has tried to create a zone of peace. They do have their own army, and we can get into whether that's a contradiction or not later. But they've tried to create a zone of radical democracy where the communes are the ones taking the decisions, and which is also based on eco-feminist principles, which is to say, much more harmony with nature and based on principles of collective working and so on and so forth. It's quite an amazing attempt, always threatened. Last year, for instance, Turkey invaded it and bombed it, but still in some ways holding on. These are examples from Europe of young people doing some really amazing things on what they call solidarity economy or social and solidarity economy. On the top left-hand side is a non-profit run cafe where young people are saying we're doing what we enjoy doing. It's great fun. We're making revenues enough for us to be able to sustain ourselves, but we're not into making profits. The one on the right hand side is a school that is able to offer very cheap, high quality education because a substantial amount of its work is done by parents who offer free time. It's called time banking. The one on the bottom left hand side is an alternative currency, which in which 5 communities are able to exchange economic goods and services with each other using their own money and not having to use the euro. So it stimulates a local economy and also social relationships as part of the economic exchange. Similarly, there's some very interesting movements called municipalism. Barcelona is an example where a woman mayor over the last few years has tried to change the way in which politics itself functions, but also especially constantly try and have an ear to the ground as to what are people's movements, what are communities saying, what are ordinary citizens saying, what sorts of issues are they facing. And in Europe, especially because the refugee crisis has been so huge, also the attempt by a number of cities to create what they call fearless cities, that is, areas where refugees can feel secure and safe and be able to have a dignified life. Um, a lot of such things have gone into making post-COVID recovery plans. Hawaii, for instance, has a feminist recovery plan, which is really, really interesting. And essentially, a lot of movements around the world are saying that recovery plans should not be about bailing out the aviation industry or the big banks, etc. It should really be about creating the Rainbow New Deal, creating the livelihood opportunities for the poor, sustaining the environment, and so on. So let me spend the last 5-6 minutes talking about what kind of macro picture emerges from this. One of the big questions we always face is, okay, there's lots of these examples all over the world, but how do they make a macro change happen? How do they actually change the big picture? And that's not an easy question to answer. It's always something we have to try and explore. But I think one of the very important things is that resistance and construction, what Indian movements call Sangharsh or Nirman, have to go together. So even as you try and undermine the power of the corporations and so on, you also work on alternatives for meeting economic needs and aspirations. Um, Aiding and supporting and being allies to the movements of the marginalized, Adivasis, Dalits, small farmers, women, etc. As we work for fundamental transformations, also work for transitional processes, creating the spaces in the system, like I said earlier. And always think of what is our vision of the future. This is something we've forgotten to do, or we're not allowed the luxury to do anymore. Dream the future, think utopian. That doesn't mean you sort of live up in the sky only, but one needs to have those visions. So if you take the Indian Constitution, in a sense, it was a utopian vision of the future, and we use that to fight for our fundamental rights now. Or we use that when the government does something that violates ecological or human rights. So we Asim and I, in that book, we called this Radical Ecological Democracy. Since then we've been using different names, but essentially the idea is, oh, and I need to again say about words. Radical these days is misused a lot. So if you say radicalized youth, it's like people who are killing each other. In fact, radical means going to the roots. So if we had radicalized youths like some of you folks, it's a great thing because we're talking about growing to our ecological roots, our cultural roots. So it simply means that wherever we are as students in a school or as members of a village community or as members of an urban colony, we should be the ones at the center of decision making. But when we do that, we also have to be responsible to other people who are impacted by our decisions and to the rest of nature, which is also impacted by our decisions. So, which is why radical ecological democracy. There's five crucial spheres to this, and I'm not going to be able to go into too much detail, but just to point these out. The Mahagram Sabha that I talked to you about is arguing for what they call radical democracy. Actually, if you look at the word democracy, demos and cracy is rule of the people. It's not rule of politicians we elect. It's not the rule of the bureaucracy, which is unfortunately what most democracies have become. It's really what Mendha Lekha said, we are the government in our village. So it's direct citizens' power, but in a way that's accountable to and responsible to others. And eventually, if you do that, you could also then expand it to looking at current political boundaries and questioning them, because they don't make ecological sense very often. They don't make cultural sense very often. I'll come back to that in a minute. The second crucial thing, the Dalit women farmers that I mentioned are saying Anna Swaraj, food sovereignty, which means for everything to do with the basic needs, basic economic needs, and the economy as a whole, again, it needs to be in the control of people, of the public, not corporations and the government. So therefore, much more about actual self-reliance, not the way the government talks about it now, much more bringing back caring and sharing in the economy. Economy is not just about I give you money and you give me a biscuit, but it's really about, do we have the social relationships that underlie these economic exchanges? Do we recognize the enormous role of women in upholding the community, and it's completely invisible? The third aspect is crucial because you can have localized economic and political democracy, but it could also be highly unequal if patriarchy, casteism, etc., continues. So then the struggles for social justice and equality, such as, for instance, again, what the Dalit women farmers have been trying to do. The fourth sphere, bottom left hand, is the culture and knowledge. India, for instance, has 780 living languages. Each of these languages is a library of knowledge. Now, when we impose a certain state language, Hindi or Bengali or Urdu or whatever it is, on top of all this huge diversity of languages, including lots of Adivasi languages, we are actually erasing that library of knowledge. And so, how do we bring back pride and sustain this diversity of languages? And that's just one aspect of culture. There's so much other things. And the same thing with knowledge. I was talking about the fact that every one of the examples I'm giving you is where a hybrid of traditional knowledge and what is best from modern knowledge has kind of been attempted to be put together. The fifth sphere, of course, is the most basic, because without ecological resilience, we'll all be dead anyway. And at the center of this flower of transformation is a set of values, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, the next few slides are actually just elaborating these, so I'm going to not go into them because we don't have the time, but I kept them there because you can all have access to this slideshow and you can look at the more elaborate versions of those. Just one point I wanted to make, and this is really important right now, is that South Asia has been divided up into national boundaries. Okay, some of them have historical roots, such as with Nepal, but some of them are also colonial. I mean, pre-colonial historical roots, but some are also products of colonialism, such as India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And to my mind, what that has done is actually it's cut across ecologically contiguous areas and culturally contiguous areas and created enormous problems of course, conflict, but also breaking communities and wildlife populations from the migration routes or from their livelihood options, such as, for instance, fishing communities between Bangladesh and India in the entire Sundarbans area, or the pastoral communities between India and China in the Ladakh, Tibet region. So this is something that we have to look at in the long run, is to start re-examining political boundaries, both within India, but also outside. So anyway, I'm going to skip through all of this. This is just more elaboration on each of those five spheres and get to what I think is my most important slide. A lot of people ask, how do we replicate what the Deccan Development Society women are doing, or how do we replicate the Kurdish Rojava? You can't. And I don't think we should try to do that. What we should try and do is say, okay, what are the processes that worked? What principles emerged out of it? And can we apply those in our own specific contexts? So I'm just listing out a bunch of them, which people like us, people like me have learned from these sorts of initiatives. It's not something that's cooked out of our own heads. Uh, and I think why this is important is because it's a very different set of values and ethics than what dominant system tells us. Just as one example, which I already gave you with education, the fourth bullet point there about cooperation versus competition, the commons and collective versus individualism. That doesn't mean that the individual is erased. Individual identity is important, but cannot be at the cost of the collective. Or if you take the qualitative pursuit of happiness, happiness not so much about buying a Reliance 40-inch color television set, but having much better social relationships, better family relationships, being able to be out in nature, have opportunities like this of mutual learning, and so on. So our human rights, and responsibilities, but also the rights of nature, the rest of nature. So there's a whole, I mean, this is actually a very interesting exercise that everybody should be doing, as to what's in our own mindsets, what's in our own visions of what we think is right and wrong. How do we decide what's right and what's wrong? Is really based on ethical principles, and I think we need much more discussion on these. And basically, we're talking about worldviews that celebrate life, not that celebrate money or whatever. Last couple of minutes, and then I'll finish. One of the things we've tried to do, as I mentioned right at the beginning, is to bring together, not just document and understand these alternative initiatives, but to bring them together to create much more collaboration, much more cross learning, much more learning across sectors. The gender movement and the youth movement and the agriculture movement and the livelihoods movement, etc. Trying to talk to each other, learn more, build more collaboration and collective vision of what India or the world could look like. So we've been doing these confluences for the last many years now, and also trying to create the possibilities for people to not just document, but also do this visioning exercise. So the book on the left-hand side, for instance, is 40 people envisioning India's future in 2100. What's an ideal future on gender and sexuality? What's an ideal future on environment? What's an ideal future for Adivasis, etc.? And then come back down to the current situation, say, okay, what pathways can we have to get there? The book in the center is 100 radical examples of alternatives from around the world, and the right hand book is actually 9 very detailed case studies of this transformation. And finally, then learning from the Indian example and similar sorts of processes happening elsewhere. We have recently started the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, like a horizontal weaving of radical alternative movements around the world, to again create much more of a critical mass for affecting macro change. So skipping this, basically, I mean, I think none of us have all the answers. Okay, these are things we have to explore and work towards. Who will lead this kind of a macro change transformation? To me, it seems more and more that youth will, but is that an easy answer, or is this much more complex? Do we need a state? And if so, what would be its role? Or can we have a completely decentralized radical democracy? If we need business, what would businesses do? We need private corporations, or can all businesses be run by communities or the public, etc.? And since many of us here are studying right now or just finished studies, how can education itself become much more transformative? So I'm just leaving these as questions. We can maybe have some discussions on them. This is things that many of us, as we were young in our school and college days, tried to do, not necessarily very successfully. But I think it's amazing to see, for instance, the mobilization of thousands of young people in India to protest against the environmental impact assessment notification. I think it's shaken the government. I hope it has. But also a lot more to be done with our own lifestyles, the consumption patterns of our organizations. Yesterday night, I was listening to a wonderful series of presentations by India by people from India, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, of the need for youth movements across all these countries to ally with each other, create cross-boundary alliances, so that the kind of divisions we have right now can be dealt with. Um, and I mean, India has, I think, the world's youngest population, or one of the world's youngest populations. So that actually is an incredible opportunity for transformation if the youth are able to take that lead. Thanks, Shriranjani. That's my email if anybody wants to be in touch further. But that's it from me right now, and hoping for a nice discussion. I will
Thank
stop
you,
sharing.
Ashish. That was incredibly insightful, and I myself have a lot of questions, but I'm opening the floor for questions. So you can either comment your questions or raise your hand so that you can speak. But we do have questions from YouTube that I'm going to. Okay, okay. These are okay. This question is okay. Yeah. Okay, I'll take Gyan's question first. You mentioned the distinction between food security and food sovereignty. Would you be able to elaborate on this and give us some examples of both in use?
Sure, Gyan, and I think there's one by Muniba just before that. I'll get to that also. So, yeah, I think, I mean, this is very important because India has a Food Security Act, which came up after a lot of movement by the Right to Food movement and so on. And I think that's very important because what it does is it uh, is supposed to make the government accountable to those who don't have adequate food, and for providing food either free or cheap or whatever it is. And that's crucial in a situation where we are right now. But what that does not do is create the possibility of people being independent about food, either by growing the food or by having the economic means to buy the food. So, food sovereignty is where you actually have those means, which is what the women of Deccan Development Society have said, that we don't want to be dependent for our food on anybody from outside. We want to be able to be independent and sovereign. Now, the notion of sovereignty, unfortunately, has mostly meant national sovereignty, India's independence from UK, from Britain, for instance. Yeah, and that's important. But the way in which communities are using sovereignty is to say we need to be independent, we need to be autonomous with regard to at least all of our basic needs. We had a very interesting webinar with a um, village in Kutch called Kunaria, where the panchayat has been doing some amazing things with community health and so on. But one of the things the Sarpanch told us was that they did recently a survey which showed that the village, that cluster of villages is spending 40 lakh rupees every month buying daily household needs, soap, footwear, etc., etc. And he said, why can't this cluster of villages actually produce all of this so that we don't pay for the profits of corporations, but we actually produce it ourselves and maybe exchange it amongst ourselves, like I can produce the footwear and you can produce the soap and we exchange it. And so that is economic sovereignty, where you create that independence. Whereas security is something where you may have enough food, but that's not necessarily in your own control. And I think that's a very important distinction to be made. um, Gyan, if you have further questions on that, I'd be happy to answer. But global governance without the UN, this is what Muniba's question. Yeah, sorry, I left that as just a statement on the slide. We're running out of time. So, see, if we think of radical democracy as something where communities, people, are in control of their own lives, um, which doesn't mean they're all isolated little republics or whatever. They are interconnected, but they have control over basic elements of their life. Then we start questioning the centrality of the nation state itself. Why, for instance, should the Adivasi population of Chhattisgarh be represented by the government of India in an international forum, when we know that in fact the government of India does not necessarily actually voice the interests of, let's say, that Adivasi population. And so the notion that one can arise that arises out of this is that maybe in addition to or in place of the United Nations, which is actually the United Nations states, where the nation states have central control, um, we also need, or in replacement, we need a United People's Assembly kind of thing. Now, nobody is very clear on how that is going to work, etc. So one has to work through that. Which is not to say that the UN itself is a useless institution. The UN has been extremely useful. For instance, the creation of global human rights standards or global environmental standards has been through the UN. So there's been that process. But we see, especially in the last 2-3 decades, there's an increasing weakening of the UN system itself as nation states become more and more authoritarian or more inward looking. And so we, and also the fact that they do not and have not represented all the peoples of the country, especially where you have countries as diverse as India, that we need also to have processes of direct representation of diverse peoples.
So Yuan's question is, we would like to hear your views on if or how supposed conflict with other countries and having competitive relations with them fuels or gives an excuse for the modern paradigm of development.
Yeah, I think this builds into the, in a sense, neo-colonial notion of development itself. That we, in order for India to, let's say, be competitive with the US, or or in order for India to be able to stand up to China, as an example, we need to have uh, a macho economy, so to speak. If you look at it, development is a very, very macho concept in the way it is right now. And so you you have a very high level of, let's say, industrialization, which feeds into a modern army which is able to stand up for itself. You have a economic sector which is controlled by a few, because when you control by a few, you're able to, the government is able to control them, or they're able to control the government. Whereas in fact, it was significantly decentralized. You wouldn't be able to have that kind of um, macho centralized control that the government or the corporations want. And um, if we see the last 60-70 years of development, it's been in this one direction. Okay, what is developed, what is not developed? And all countries except possibly Bhutan to some extent, and I think recently New Zealand partially, have fallen into the same race. So we want to show that we are the largest or the second largest or the fifth largest economy in the world. How do you do that? You have to do it through GDP growth. It doesn't matter if 600 million people are not benefiting from it. You have shown 8% economic growth rate. You want to feed a heavily militarized situation in, say, Kashmir. You have to have, you generate the resources which is able to do that. You won't work on the softer, or what some people might call the more feminized versions of doing, of trying to solve problems, say for instance by dialogue. India and Pakistan could have entered into a much more robust process of dialogue, or Indians, the rest of India vis-a-vis Kashmir could have entered into a much more robust process of dialogue uh, to be able to solve the problems rather than use militarized options. So it's all, the industrial military complex is built on or feeds into this notion of what is developed and not developed, and that's where this kind of competitiveness becomes very important, but destructive.
Okay. Before I move on to the next chat question, I have a question myself because I think it's related. Um, I remember you made an interesting point where you said that the government's not necessarily resistive in all situations, but in some places, politicians are sensitive and there has been collaboration, and these are the outcomes. So, um, what I'm thinking of is, as young people, we need to vote for more people who are sensitive politicians, or all politicians need to be sensitive and not what is projected today, but mainly like in in like an ecological democracy, is it gonna be leaderless? Are there leaders? How will like the voting happen on, and like with respect to like politics, how will that work?
Mm. I think the notion of leadership will be there, but the notion will be different from what it is right now. Right now, what we have is maybe two kinds of leaders. One is, say, the political leaders who try and capture power in any which way through electoral politics and so on. And then there's the social cultural leaders, let's say, the film stars and the whatever people we look up to as icons of some kind. In both cases, what tends to happen is that it actually disempowers those who are not in that position, because in both cases you've got power that is centralized. What the Zapatistas say is that the best leader is the one who follows, and they have built a number of principles for this, which is to say that every person who is in any leadership position has to be reporting to the population constantly, has to explain his or her actions and decisions all the time, and is not going to be in that position for long, maybe a few months, maybe a year. So there's a rotation that is taking place, and because of that rotation, many or all people have the ability to learn leadership skills. So today I'm a leader, you're a follower. Tomorrow you're a leader and I'm a follower. It creates a much more horizontal process of what could be leadership. Secondly, leadership can be in so many different ways. If you're a woman who is shown how to grow enough food in 2 acres of land for your whole family and grow 40 species of crops, and I'm giving a real life example, okay, here I'm thinking of a person in Andhra Pradesh, in Telangana, that's a leader. Now, she doesn't hold a political position, but she is an agricultural leader, right? So I think we need to disaggregate and decentralize and distribute the idea of leadership significantly in this kind of an alternative world. And which then means that we have to question also electoral politics. To me, I've written an article on this saying that elections are actually the enemy of democracy. Because what it does, and we see that now, is it just makes us more and more hostilely competitive. Those who are richest are the ones who are able to fight the elections. You create divisions in society with your own caste lines or class lines or etc. And it is not conducive to a healthy democracy. What alternatives do we have to elections? We have situations where, for instance, communities say that we will take a decision only on the basis of consensus, not on majority. And the other big issue with election-based politics is majoritarianism, which we see right now, where one religion is imposing itself on everything else in India, and because it's a majority. So I think we need to be able to find processes of consensus building, processes by which minorities have as much say, or in fact are given special preference, which needs to build the political maturity. We have to build the political maturity for that to happen. And that's what mature leadership would be about.
Thank you. So, a question is, what is your from Falguni? What is your take on the climate crisis with regards to the current pandemic, positives and negatives?
Uh, I think the negative is, of course, that mm, in the like I said earlier, that governments and corporations are using the pandemic as an excuse for more authoritarian, more profit-making activities. I think Amazon, etc., have had jumps in their profits. What's his name? Bezos has become even has richer by some several $billion in the last 2-3 months. And as we see in India and elsewhere, states are using this as an excuse for all kinds of authoritarian things, or for pushing through policy measures, environmental clearances, etc., because nobody can go out on the streets and protest. So, in that sense, I think it's bad news for the climate. It is, however, good news for climate if we are able to open up our eyes, as the pandemic as the virus has helped us to do, to the relationship between pandemics, ecological devastation, and climate and biodiversity. and to the possibilities of a different way out. So, where across the world people have shown solidarity in the midst of this pandemic, we have lots of examples. I think my colleague Srishti may be there. She can put up a document we made on how communities are being resilient in the time of COVID. Is that if we learn from these processes and communities, we should be able to say that the recovery needs to be climate friendly, ecology friendly, and people friendly, and that it's possible. This is not a pipe dream, it's not an impossibility. It is actually possible if the investments that are going right now into trying to go back to the previous normal, which was not normal anyway, instead of that, into investments for the kind of activities that I've been mentioning. So I think it could be very positive for the climate, but that's going to require a huge global movement to make that happen.
Yeah. Would Wanch has a question of how do you think us as a movement, so Fridays for Future India as a movement, can improve and make our voices heard?
Well, what little I know about the Fridays for Future movement, or say the Extinction Rebellion, or Let India Breathe, and others, is just from discussions in the last few 2-3 months, maybe. And so I wouldn't claim to know everything about what you folks are doing, but the I think you're already in some senses in heading in the right direction when you're trying to organize discussions like this, because I think it's very important for young people to take a leadership, to have your own perspectives, but also learn from the experience of the last 40, 50 years or 200 years of activism of various kinds. And to have a historical perspective even as you think about the present and the future. So one, and secondly, like the journey that I talked about for myself and my colleagues in Kalpavriksha, is to try and understand the multiple dimensions and the intersectorality of the environmental crisis, so that it's not looked at only from a biological point of view or only from an economic point of view, but like looking at all the cultural, economic, political, social aspects also. And the third is, and this is probably the most difficult one, is to see how we can not just learn about the values and ethics of different movements and what we need to do, but imbibe them in our own work, functioning and work. So, for instance, how can Fridays for Future be a completely democratic horizontal movement rather than become something again where a few people start holding control? I'm not saying that's how it is, but these are all process. And in fact, unfortunately, most NGOs in the country don't do that. Most NGOs or movements have also, even as they espouse democracy and equality, they themselves internally are extremely, very often hierarchical. So these are struggles that we also have to look at in our own functioning.
Yes, for sure. Thank you. And I think Meher's question is a really good question, but it's also really long. So I'll read it out loud, but you read it too. How does one break, or what is the way to move away from the global hegemony of insane trade that lies at the heart of a long supply chains for all the different commodities? Trade deficits considered such as an important parameter and makes our local resource sovereignty some kind of utopian thinking instead of a more grounded roadmap for reclaiming our lives and local economies.
Okay, Meher, very complex question. We need a whole separate webinar on this. Um, so I think at least two things are important, and neither of these is going to be the full answer. One, to expose the unsustainability and injustice of the current global trading system, or supply and demand system. And we have to do that. We have to get much better at this. So when in 1991 the Indian government moved into globalized into globalization, Indian economy moving into globalization, one of the things many of us argued was that this is only going to significantly increase the supply chains and the trade, and make us more and more dependent on external economies for export, import, etc., apart from all the ecological problems. and that this could be disastrous because tomorrow, if for some reason that trade stops, we will collapse. And as we've seen, for instance, in the 2008 economic collapse, and now with COVID. So that's one huge thing that has to be continuously exposed with proper studies and evidence and so on. Uh, and the second thing is, uh, so three things actually. So the second thing is then resist that kind of trade, which means to be able to undermine through consumer boycotts, through exposes of what these corporations and so on are doing, is to undermine their power and their credibility. Mm. And which means we also have to change as consumers, for instance. And the third is to actually support localized economies, which means build much more relationships, say, with our neighboring farmers. Um, as we have many examples in India where consumers in cities have built relationships with farmers for organic produce, and that creates a local circular economy which is much more robust, which is not dependent on the external market system. So be able to create much more of these with crafts, with food, with different kinds of products and services, to then slowly, and as we spread that, that also is a way by which you undermine the power of the corporations. In Europe, a number of alternative currencies, for instance, as they grow, they also threaten the centralized money system and those who control the central money. And that's how you slowly then even undermine the power of capitalism and state domination. So we need these two, three different kinds of things to be able to work on these alternatives. And I don't want to, in any case, suggest or seem to mean that any of this is easy. It's difficult, it's complex, it's messy, and it's long term. Not going to happen in the next 3 years or 5 years.
Okay,
Before
so
that,
has
Milun had a point about the independent UN institutions and agencies, which I agree with. So I don't know if people have read that, but yeah, the UN has been able to also create institutions which are independent of nation states, and I think those remain very important. Which is why I would say that we need, say, the People's Assembly kind of thing to be, I don't know, eventually replace the UN or not. That's a very difficult question to ask, but at least to be complementary and to create a complementary or a parallel power um, system, which is also global, which emerges from and represents diverse peoples around the world.
Som has a question: from which country should India take inspiration for converting to green recovery?
Rainbow recovery. So I think there's no one country from where you can take inspiration, but different countries have different kinds of revolutionary, amazing things happening. Let's take Cuba and its agricultural model. It's one of the most incredible models in the world. And it happened partly because of its own internal politics, but also because of the sanctions that the US put on it in the 1970s or whatever. Um, and for instance, urban agriculture in Havana in Cuba is amazing. No? Half or more of the food needs is met from urban agriculture itself. So that's a sector we can learn, let's say, from Cuba. We can learn how to, instead of using GDP, how do we use a index of well-being? Bhutan uses national happiness. There are many problems with it, but it's a very interesting way of looking at it. Recently, New Zealand has started looking at well-being as a way of assessing how developed it is or not. So there's countries like that that we can learn from in terms of economic indicators and how we assess progress. Um, there are many other countries that have, for instance, some of the Latin American countries, which have been able to move a bit more towards what's called plurinationality, which is to say that we are a single nation, yes, but we recognize that each of the indigenous peoples in our country is itself a nation and has the right to self-determination. The same government sometimes violates that, but at least in principle and in the constitution, that is accepted. So can the Indian constitution say that, okay, the Gond Adivasis in central India are their own nation and have the right to self-determination, but within a certain context. So there's that one can learn from. So there's a whole, I think different thing from different countries that is positive, which we could learn from, and also COVID recoveries. It's an interesting study that was done recently that where countries are led by women, they've been able to recover from COVID much better and much faster than where they're led by men. Now, is there something in that? Probably there is. So that's why, for instance, New Zealand is a very interesting example, and some others.
Yeah. Okay, I think this is the last question that I want to ask. Maybe the conditioned capitalism in me is nagging, and it's basically these kinds of transitions, they take a long time, like more than 5 to 10 years. And as like a question from a young environmentalist to an experienced environmentalist, um, in your years of experience in like environmentalism, how, as you unlearn and learn things about the systems of oppression, how have you been able to like stick to your principles while also like sustaining yourself socially, economically, everything?
The short answer to that is I haven't. I mean, I think there's probably some things I've succeeded in doing, others that I've failed in doing. I think, for instance, if you take lifestyles, I don't think I live a sustainable lifestyle. There's still many elements of what I do which can and should be changed. Um, I think one of the things we were attempted to do as a collective more than as an individual is like with Kalpavriksh, and again, it's not like we're a unqualified success, but to build a much more horizontal structure. Like everybody, every member of Kalpavriksh is involved in all decisions. There's no president, no secretary, no nothing. And also that the economic remuneration is well below market rates, and we have a 1:2, I think a 1:2 or 1:3 ratio between those who are the highest paid and the lowest paid. Now recently I heard about an NGO, in a conservation NGO in Bangalore, whose ratio between highest and lowest paid is 1:400. uh, so these, I think, I mean, these are some examples where we try and follow some of these principles. We don't necessarily manage to do it all the time, but I think this is why we need more collective processes, because as an individual it's very difficult sometimes. Now I cycle to office and work, okay, about 7-8 kilometers, 15 kilometers total. But every time I do that, I have my heart in my mouth, because it's such an unsafe cycling environment in Pune, as in all Indian cities. So what we also need, apart from that individual action, which I don't know how long I'll be able to do, is a collective action in which we argue for cycling lanes, for safer transportation and traffic, and so on. So I think the thing of meeting one's principles or keeping one's principles is both the individual choices that we make, but also, and I would say even more importantly, the collective processes that we can build. And the last thing I would say here is that in our relationships with communities, this is very important, because people like us, when we go to a local community in a village, for instance, or a poor colony in a city, we go with our own privileges. We go with our own biases. We go, the language we speak, the clothes we wear, everything shows, reeks of a certain elite privilege. No? So how does one uh, get out of that by being much more, or trying to be much more humble, but going as not as a teacher but as a learner, by going and actually sitting with, eating with, being with, by crossing social, cultural, class boundaries? These are all things we'll have to learn over time and get much better at, if we want to be credible to the lives of the most marginalized people, who should be, in fact, their own agents of transformation, and if we want to help with that kind of transformation.
Okay. We have two more questions. Those are the last questions I'm going to take. Do you have time?
Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah.
Okay. Um, so Avantika is asking if India can turn completely into using renewable in future, or do we have to balance between renewable and non-renewable? So what do you think?
So, Avantika, I think it's not a question of can we. I think it's a question of whether we
When
must, and I think we must. We don't have an option. We don't. We cannot rely on fossil fuels anywhere in the world anymore. Uh, can we do it in terms of the feasibility? Absolutely, because renewable energy has actually become significantly cheaper even in the last 10 years. It's like by a factor of several times, right? But there's an important caveat here, and I think that's two important caveats. One, we can't think of energy or any other sector as a demand driven sector, which is to say, if we say that every demand on energy that India has is justified and therefore we have to keep meeting the supply, keep making the supply meet that demand, we will never be sustainable, even with complete renewable energies. Okay, because solar energy needs mining somewhere, it needs space, wind energy needs space, and we are already seeing conflicts on the ground, even with these mega renewable energy projects. So, how much demand is justified as a whole in society, and especially within the most elite sections of society, is has to be a question that we have to ask ourselves. Um, are we justified in using the amount of air conditioning that we use? Are we justified in this sort of the way in which malls are lit up every night all across the country, or are we justified in having day-night matches, cricket matches, which use enormous amounts of power? These are questions we will have to ask ourselves. But and the second important thing is how the renewables are produced, who takes the decision, and under whose control they are. So just like with food, we also need to move towards energy sovereignty, which means that every community should be able to have control over its energy, which means renewable also has to be decentralized. It cannot be these mega solar parks and so on, which Mr. Modi is promoting. So I would say these two things are very important to answer that question of whether in fact renewables can be adequate. And if we question demand, then yeah, there's a huge amount of completely luxury and unnecessary demand on energy that we have, which we simply cannot afford. We have to be able to stop it.
I think the last question is a really important and great question. So, climate alarmism is becoming more vivid and maybe acceptable with the pandemic and the great halt in our economy. With that in mind, how long do you think before we have climate conversations at the center for elections in India? Because it has become like a keystone in Western elections. So, after all, we need subverting existing power structures to make long term systemic shifts beyond the citizen uprising. So, when do you think climate will become the central of electoral at the center of electoral politics?
Yeah. So Meher, well, I think that's kind of two questions in one. But yeah, I'm actually surprised, or maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but I'm alarmed about the fact that climate hasn't become a central electoral or central issue in political discussions. It should have by now, but it isn't. And I think one of the reasons is that the environmental movement has also not been very strategic and what's say communicative enough to show how the climate crisis is also a crisis of livelihoods, is also a crisis uh, insecurity, economic insecurity, is also a crisis of floods and droughts and so on and so forth. So those connections haven't been adequately made in a way that the public can understand them, and in a way that's not just cerebral but also emotional. It reaches people's hearts. So, for instance, this year's floods or the droughts we went through, or the kind or of course, this pandemic, there's very little public discussion, even from ourselves, to show that this is connected to the climate crisis. So that's very important. But the second thing also is that let's not make the climate crisis submerge all other crises. The biodiversity crisis predates the climate crisis by many decades, and it also significantly impacts people's livelihoods and, of course, destroys wildlife. And of course, the two are connected, but they're not necessarily exactly the same thing. The pollution crisis is not necessarily a climate crisis. So I think the more we're able to relate environment to people's daily lives, health and livelihoods, especially through food, through the air we breathe, etc., the more we will be able to make these um, everyday items of discussion. And in that sense, I think the EIA notification may well be India's George Floyd environmental movement, because I haven't seen this level of mobilization on environmental issues for a long, long time. I think we had it maybe last with the Indian Forest Act in the 1980s or 90s. And so this is actually an amazing opportunity right now when so many people are talking about this, and it's gone into not just environmental but also all kinds of other movements, including of course many of you, that we are able to make those connections between, and also the livelihood insecurity that hundreds of millions of people have faced with the pandemic. um, let's make those connections, say that that is also an ecological issue, and the recovery therefore needs to be something that links livelihoods, links insecurity, links climate, links environment together. So those narratives, and we need all of you to create the narratives, to do it in different forms, the cartoons, the memes, the 1 minute short videos, the whatever. I mean, you folks are great at that, so I think we need to do much more of that, like you some of what you've done in the EIA campaign.
Thank you so much. I think with that answer, you've given us so much to think about and how we need to drive our narratives and what's next for the movement. And today's talk has been incredibly insightful. So I want to thank you on behalf of the movement. And thank you everyone for joining today. Um, Hopefully, we have more of these discussions and keep learning from each other and keep figuring out how to change the systems and proceed with like the Rainbow New Deal. So, thank you.
Thanks, Ranjani. Thanks, Tarun, and everybody else at Fridays for Future for this opportunity.
All right.
If this is recorded, to send me the